Morning, friends, foes and countrymen. I'm going to respond to the diabolical attack by Shelley May O'Brien of Bury St Edmunds. That's public domain knowledge. You can look up loss of an unfair dismissal claim when she was fired from a nursing home in 2000. Maybe the court case was, the hearing was 2019 anyway. Look, she was fired from a nursing home. She lost her application for unfair dismissal. It's in the public domain. She's also talked about her very colourful past and her self-proclamation as a witch. But that's not what this is. This is in response to some disturbing things she brought up, which is all Hoaxted material rehashed since I tried to expose the Hampstead cover-up. I'm trying not to dissociate, and I'm also trying not to be self-pitying. So yeah, where was I? Anyway, so she launched an attack regurgitating old news and misinformation and brutal trolling of my family, and she now thinks she's going to get me in jail where Ricky and Karen have not. So I'm going to address some of the stuff she says is just pure ridiculous, like I'm a terrorist and I'm going to kill people, and what else did she call me? A child trafficker, a child abuser, all sorts of ridiculousness. But I'm going to address some of the things with a kernel of truth that she's twisted for her own narrative, and in some ways she's only following those that did it before. I'm going to entitle this Child Abuse Survivors Parenting. And my daughter and I have had this discussion because when we kind of go in and out of relationship, and when we're good, we're very, very good. And we've had these discussions like, I've said to her, should I have had you adopted? Would that have been better? And she's like, no, I don't think so, because it's a lottery whether you get, you know, that I think statistics show that children are abused more in the care system than with a wounded parent. And a lot of children were deliberately trafficked under the guise of adoption, purposely, to abusers, paedophile. Oh, you're not allowed to say that word on YouTube according to somebody. But I also think you are not instructed to say maths, which is not a correct description of people that hurt children. But let me just go back to this. I was so touched by being I've only watched a couple of the videos Shelley May has put out. Unfortunately, I stopped before she escalated. I don't know whether she was using any substances or whether it was just pure bile. But I have been kept informed by fellow survivors and supporters. And they will be reported today, and I certainly will at least liaise with the 4 police services that are looking into Miss O'Brien. Current investigations into Miss O'Brien, so it might be projections saying I'm going to jail. Just saying. So I have often addressed this, and anybody with the patience to go through my video archives or my BitChute will find me addressing the issues over and over again. I've tried to stay away from addressing the issues with my children, because I regret having, I think I do regret, I probably regret having discussed them when I first came online around 2009, something like that. Like never knowing that people like Shelley May and her predecessors would troll through everything on the net to find my weak spots to try and silence me. And it's always been that, come for me, I've survived much worse, but come for my children and I'm coming back. So I tried to not address, my children are grown, 24, 27, 35 now, but these things still trigger and hurt. But I figure that I might as well address it head on again, because the stable door is already open. You can't, what's it? There's no point shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. So here we go. And I really appreciate, in particular, the survivor who messaged me this morning and said, I'm really triggered. Shelley May said this. Is it true? So I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse, no consent medical experiments, drugging, trafficking, and a lot of what happened to myself, my sisters, and my mother while my father was doing 25 years in the Air Force comes under the umbrella of MK Ultra. Not an excuse. There's 5 at least documented generations of abuse victims or abusers in my family, starting with my Irish granddad, and just a family tree that would make you shudder. So I'm a generational abuse survivor. And 5 documented generations, including my mother, my father, myself, my siblings, my daughter, my niece, and one of her children have been abused, at least cousins as well, and so on. So at 20, what age was I? 28, I emigrated to California. And within a very short, I was targeted there. I didn't realize it was targeting at the time, by an Italian-American Sicilian, you know, out of mafia stock. His parents had left Sicily and their names never to be mentioned again, or feuds could break out. Anyway, Priory of Zion, very, very wealthy American Italian, basically stalked me until I went to bed with him at 28. And then again went to bed with him a second time, even though I regretted the first time. But it was 1985, and I didn't know any better. So after sleeping with him a second time, I then got the courage to say, I don't want a relationship with you, thank you. And then I found out I was pregnant. And I am generally against abortion, but I booked an abortion under pressure from him, and feeling ashamed that I just emigrated to America with great plans and a degree under my belt, and a postgrad, and I got pregnant to somebody I didn't even like, let alone love. But 1 or 2 nights before the abortion, I had a dream and I cancelled it. And I said I'd go ahead and somehow make it work to be pregnant in a foreign land. Because I was too proud to come home within weeks of having emigrated and say, oops, I got pregnant. And Ireland was not a good place to come home to in the 80s pregnant as a single parent. single woman. So anyway, I had my daughter in California. And that's a story in itself. It's quite traumatic. I got arrested at, I think I was 8 months pregnant, 8 months pregnant. I got arrested for overstaying my visa, having been reported by a jealous ex of the father who had waited. She had had an abortion to him, and she'd waited for years for him to make good on his promise to marry her and have a family. He'd already been divorced twice by the time I met him. He had two daughters in one marriage. And I later discovered he was a paedophile. Not much later, 15 years later, 15, 16 years later. But the signs were there if I was not blinded by my own wounding and gaslit by my toxic family and professionals. So I was arrested at 7 or 8 months pregnant. Then I was released, and I was released after a few hours on bail. It's the only arrest in my life. And he had planned to marry me at that stage because he wanted me to raise the child with him in her life, living in California. Thank God. God moves in mysterious ways, because I returned to Ireland just before her 4th birthday. So he was going to marry me, just, we were clearly not in love, nor living together, nor had we ever slept together more than that twice in the early days of my emigrating. But after I got arrested because of his ex reporting me, allegedly, and got released on bail, he bottled it and said, oh, I can't marry you now. I could go to jail. I could get a $10,000 fine, blah, blah, blah. So I married someone else who was a lovely person, a friend. And I got my green card and I worked, and I was about 6 months off getting citizenship. And then the earthquake happened in '89. But I'm going to disclose something new here as well, because I will go to my grave with nothing hidden. And though I regret discussing my life in terms of how it affected my children, for good and for bad, the cat's out the bag, so I'll just address it. And I've raised my children to be strong and to be honest. So although this stirs up a lot of pain in our family, I have confidence that we'll survive it, as we have. So part of my motivation for emigrating was to distance myself from my toxic family. And like almost every abuse survivor, child abuse survivor, my passion was never to have my children go through what I went through, or any other children, what I and millions went through. 1 in 4 is estimated in Ireland are abused before the age of 18. My sisters and I were victims of multiple abusers and trafficking and drugging and so on and so forth. I'm supposed to write that book. I keep saying I'm going to take a sabbatical to write my book and quit cigarettes. So when I backed out of the abortion and decided that somehow I'd make it work, miracles started to happen. And I gave birth in California, Marin County, and I was thrilled. And my daughter literally never left my side for 2 years. I breastfed her till she was 2. She came everywhere with me. It was a transition from being single and driving a convertible sports car and, living the life, to being a mother. But I was passionately in love with my daughter. Absolutely. I think, and I've said it many times, she kept me alive, really. I don't know if I would have bothered staying around without that reason to live. So I was involved with what I later discovered was a cult until she was 3, maybe, for a decade, from 82 to 92. So yeah, I was still involved with a cult. I didn't know it was a cult. It's very much like Scientology, called EST, the Forum or Landmark Institute. I worked 2 jobs during my pregnancy because I didn't have insurance. Birth cost about $8,000 in '86. But actually, one of the jobs I was working got me insurance through work, even though I was pregnant. But I worked 2 jobs until she was about 6 weeks old. And then I tried going back to one of the jobs when she was 6 weeks old, because at that time I thought, oh, I'll just get a nanny and she'll be fine. And I'll express milk for the nanny to give her, and you know, I'll interview and get references and everything. I'm going to ramble here because this is hard for me to address, but I will. I did take references and do interviews and get a nanny when she was 6 weeks old, and I put the nanny on the insurance on my car, and she drove me to work the first day with my daughter in the car seat and instructions on her routine for the day, and to collect me from work at 5 o'clock. This highly referenced nanny dropped me to work, and when she collected me at 5 o'clock, she hadn't been home with my daughter. She'd driven around, delighted with herself, having access to a vehicle with my daughter and a baby bag. It's all like, I was just horrified. I fired her on the spot and I quit my job. And I just thought, I just completely changed my mind about parenting and working by putting my child in childcare or hiring a nanny, whatever. And I just when I realized my daughter's nappy was wet, she was clearly disturbed at being out of her routine and being separated from me. Yeah, I said she never left my side for 2 years. Well, other than that one day of trying to go back to work. And I spent the whole 8 hours at work anyway, missing her terribly and feeling guilty. And so when the nanny turned up in the car with my daughter, having probably not left her car seat all day, and except for to be bottle fed or, you know, express. So I fired her and I quit that job, and I qualified as a licensed childcare provider so that I could earn a living and be with my daughter. And I successfully ran a daycare in Sausalito for 3 years. It grew. I ended up having 5 staff. It was very exhausting. I worked 8 till 6, Monday to Friday, plus 1 weekend a month, plus prep time before and after. It was just exhausting, but I was able to earn a living and have my daughter by my side. When I did start to, you know, trust to leave her with somebody once in a while, I had an elderly, well, she was 74, well, she was probably about 72 at that time, 73, elderly neighbor who was just like a granny and adorable, who I used to pop up to with my daughter and have a chat and a giggle, and she would play the accordion for my daughter and give her mini cocktail sausages in jelly, which for some bizarre reason, my daughter loved, and give her thimbles to play with, and just a real old-fashioned granny figure. And I was living, you know, thousands of miles away from my family, and they're pretty toxic anyway, but you know, the way rose-colored glasses work. So eventually this neighbor persuaded me, just, you know, I'd go shopping and she'd just say, just leave her here for an hour, she'll be fine. And I'd have been there for an hour already, and I could see she was fine. She loved this neighbor and was comfortable and so on. So I started letting her watch her for an hour or two, maybe once a week. And then that went on for about a year. Because I think I tried to go back at work when she was 6 weeks old. Then I fired the nanny and decided that was never going to work. I think it took about a year. I had maternity leave. I think I had maternity pay. And I hadn't had to pay for the birth. And so I think I had about a year of just working one of the two jobs, which was a live-in job where I could have her with me. Can't remember the exact timeline. Timelines are hard when you have DID, which is not an excuse for anything. But this neighbor, you know, I became more comfortable with having her babysit my daughter. And occasionally we'd both stay the night there. I don't know why, or for what reason. But anyway, as part of the cult thing, I signed up to do a 5-day course in Los Angeles. I'm pretty sure I did 2 5-day courses in LA. One was called Presentation, Negotiation and Enrollment, and the other was called The Mastery of Empowerment. Maybe I did one before I had her, I can't remember, but anyway, this second 5-day course in Los Angeles came up, and with hindsight, it was a high pressure cult where, you know, if you said you couldn't do something, they accused you of putting up obstacles. So against my better judgment, I asked Granny Eve, we used to call her, if she would have Gabriella for 5 days while I went to LA and did this course. And she agreed. And again, unbeknownst to me, she had a visit in my absence from her 25-year-old grandson, who just turned up and was surprised to find a 2.5-year-old there, and orally raped her for a couple of days, repeatedly, allegedly, because she was too young to testify. And the outcome of that reporting to the police and professionals was that although they absolutely believed my daughter, she was very verbal and very confident, blossoming from having had breastfeeding for 2 years and close attachment bonding. Unfortunately, I left the course in LA after 4 days, and I figured I would surprise her and just go, because I had a key to the apartment, just go to the apartment, and I was going to just snuggle in bed beside her and take her home early next day. And so I let myself in. I got back to Marin County. I got back about, I don't know, it was like 2 in the morning or something. And I tiptoed into her bedroom, and she was hypervigilant, and she was instantly awake. And she went, "Mommy, let's go home." And I was surprised, but I usually would move mountains to do as my daughter asked, unless it was something dangerous, which she never did. But anyway, I quietly packed her bag, and we drove home. And the precious, innocent little girl that I had left 4 days earlier had turned into an abuse victim. She started bedwetting. She'd been potty trained for a while. she started stammering. She started panicking at the sound of sirens. The apartment was close to the hospital, and sirens was a normal background noise, but she had become hypersensitized to everything because she'd been orally raped by this visitor to Granny Eve's. I talked to my colleague at the daycare and said something's wrong, and she said, yeah, there's definitely some very worrying symptoms. And I went to the police and then got a child psychologist involved, and my daughter disclosed. She did drawings, and the police and professionals were absolutely convinced that she was telling the truth. They pulled in the grandson for an interview, but they said children under the age of 4 are not allowed to give testimony in court, no matter how verbal or clear they are, no matter what our opinions are. It won't survive a court case. But what we are going to do is flag this abuser across all 50 states of America, so that if any other accusations or allegations come in, he'll be immediately picked up. And then they offered victim support for both of us. Gabriella had a year's child therapy, play therapy, they called it, art and puppet play, and just counselling, for age-appropriate counselling, for a year. And I had as well, because I just wanted to die. I felt it was all my fault. Something I'd overlooked in thinking how lovely Granny Eve was, and how ideal she was, and how trustworthy she was that she, with hindsight again, was kind of a functioning alcoholic. And because my mother was first addicted to Valium and then Librium and then alcohol, and there's a lot of alcoholism in the country I'm living and in the family background, it seemed normal. It seemed like a normal thing to me. But her grandson knew that once Gabriella was in bed, his granny would open a naggin of vodka, whatever, and drink and do the same again, probably at 4:30 in the morning, before Gabriella would wake at 7. And so he knew the times when his granny would be not responsible, with hindsight. So we spent a year intensely healing from that. She was 2.5. Before she was 4, I came back home with her. There were red flags about her father as well. But again, I was talked out of it. And this is how clever abusers are, and their protectors. Yeah, there was something blew up about her father. Somebody had reported him with his older daughters, who were about 8 and 10 at the time, maybe 6 and 8, probably 8 and 10. And a social worker had reported him for inappropriate touching of his 8-year-old in public. And his access to them was suspended for about 10 weeks while social services investigated it. But he was a school teacher, and he was regularly published in the New York Times and different publications as a renowned cutting-edge educator. He was also a property developer, slum landlord as well in Berkeley. But very wealthy man and very educated man, and very manipulative narcissist. And when the social worker said to him, there's been a report of you touching your 8-year-old inappropriately in a public setting, he convinced her oh, I'm Sicilian. We're touchy-feely people. That was nothing. It's like it wouldn't even enter my mind that my daughter might be prepubescent or that might be inappropriate. And you guys have just blown this all out of proportion and it's nothing. And they went along with that and restored regular contact. But he told me this story from his perspective, and that should have been a red flag. And then I knew he would have access to my daughter on the same day as he'd have his two older daughters. And I felt comforted like that, you know, the 8 and 10-year-old were there, but at the same time, I remember slight disquiet. And I should have listened to that. And so I started my daycare, worked from home with my daughter, and got a bigger home, and you know, was successful but very exhausted. And that awful, when that happened when she was 2.5, I think I brought her back to Ireland for an extended. I think I took 4 months off the daycare. I paid my assistant to run the daycare for 4 months because I just didn't know where to turn or what to do or how to forgive myself. And I also at that time was offered by a reformed gangster who'd spent 32 years in and out of jail, bank robber. My mum met him through AA out there. She got sober out there. But he said to me, I still have contacts. If you say the word, I'll have him kneecapped or left dead in a ditch. You just say the word and it's done. And I asked him to let me think about it for a month, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't, much as I wanted to, you know, because the grandson had long since gone back to Minneapolis. Never got near my daughter again, but that wasn't the point. He'd already orally raped her a few times for 2 days. But I couldn't give the go ahead to kneecap or kill him. Just couldn't. So we kind of tried to. I remember I was going to a church at the time, the Lord's Church in San Rafael, and obviously I brought my daughter up for prayer, and they prayed that she would have her memory absolutely wiped of everything that had happened to her, and the trauma and the fear of sirens and the hypervigilance, all the fallout. And that prayer was answered. She had no memory of it. She just healed. She had no memory of it. But I didn't know about cellular memories, where you internalize trauma. Even if you don't remember it, you internalize it, and your body and soul remember it. But that happened later. Nor did I take into account that she would one day go through my paperwork, dealing with the police, dealing with the child psychologist, and so on. But so she healed, and the drawings changed, and the memories went. And I lasted about another 1.5 years out there, and then I just thought, no, I'm going home. So I came back, first of all, to Ireland in just before 1990, like, you know, a couple of weeks before 1990, when she had her 4th birthday in 1990. And then I got depressed again because I was staying at the farm in the toxic family, right back, isolated, and just used to sink into depression there, not even knowing all the details of why, but was persuaded by a friend to go back to England, where I'd spent a lot of my childhood and early 20s. So I went back to England with my daughter, and I took her father to court for child support, and he managed to get it reduced by $1,000 a month, no, $1,000 a year, by saying he would go and visit her once a year. And I was kind of rosy tinted glasses, even though I'd had red flags about him. There was another incident where, as a school teacher in Berkeley, he'd been attacked with a knife by the brother of one of his students. And I just thought it was a random thing that he taught in Berkeley, and you know, it could be a dangerous place to teach, and you know, he got attacked by a knife. But only years later did I put it together. Why would the brother of a student go in and stab a teacher unless he'd abused a student? Didn't click at the time. So I came back to England, and I got engineered into another relationship with the Disney, but I ended that after a year. And then it was just myself and my daughter, and the father was coming over once a year for a visit. By then she was about I can't remember anyway. I should write this all down to get the timeline right. But one visit he was coming for, he planned a 5-day holiday with her. He was going to go from Suffolk, where I was living, to the Isle of Wight, where my social worker sister was living and working. And she'd taken the 5 days off, and her and my daughter's father were going to have lots of fun with my daughter. And so he arrived, he was just spending one night at our house and then due to go off on the train with my daughter to my sister's the next day. And I stupidly, again, you can see all your mistakes with hindsight. My daughter had bunk beds, and I thought it would be okay for her dad to sleep on the bottom bunk. My daughter always used to sleep on the top bunk. She had bunk beds so that she could have her cousins stay for sleepovers at the weekend, or friends or whatever. And I made the stupid mistake of allowing him to sleep in the bottom bunk. And years later, she told me that he touched her intimate parts under the guise of pulling her nightie down and putting her duvet up. She used to kick her covers off and whatever. But she has an absolute frozen memory of him inappropriately touching her vagina, and then getting into the bottom bunk and masturbating. She was supposed to be asleep above, but she was actually wide awake. Obviously, it must have triggered her on some level to what had happened to her at 2.5. And I'm looking out the window deliberately. I can't look myself in the face. This never should have happened. But I'm trying to stay clear, to just give the facts. I disclosed to some extent on a Matt Taylor live, and he talks about it being when he made me cry. He didn't make me cry, this made me cry. But I think that's probably disappeared when his channel got nuked. Talked about it in videos. I've never talked about the first abuse she suffered. So anyway, years later, I discovered what he'd done was when he went to bed, she had kicked her duvet off and her nightie had ridden up, and under the pretext of fixing her, he put his hands where they shouldn't have been, and then got into the bunk below and masturbated. And a child describes masturbation, she just said it. She described how he was breathing and everything, so it was clear he'd masturbated after touching her. And I think what he had planned was much worse than that over the coming 5-day holiday. The only saving grace is that in the morning, my daughter, from being excited about going to Auntie Fiona's and plans to go to the seaside and the fair and the this and that and the other, from being excited, she absolutely changed her mind. I think she was 6 at the time, 6 or 7. And although I'd missed so many things in the past, I was absolutely tuned in to my daughter. And when she said in the morning she didn't want to go on the holiday, and she wouldn't say why, but I completely honoured her wishes and cancelled it. And he was furious. He was furious. He's like, how can you do this? How can you spoil her like that? She's just having nerves. Like, it's going to be fine. Your sister's expecting us. It's all planned out. You know, I've spent a fortune, da, da, da. And I said, I'm sorry. She's only 6. I'm not forcing her. And so we put him on a train without my daughter. And that was that. Life carried on. Life carried on. That was to her memory. And I think she is pretty clear on, she's got a frozen memory of the abuse. There were a couple of other times she creeped him out, but he didn't touch her. But I think he would have raped her if he had gone ahead with that. With what I know now, I think he would have raped her with that 5-day holiday. But by the grace of God, she didn't go on that. And I don't think I ever left her unsupervised with him again. Just, anyway. So she was probably 7. She and I have sat and tried to piece together the exact details. Then I got married when I got back together with the Disney one after being apart for 1.5 years or something. I married him, and he had groomed me as well, especially through my daughter's single parents. You need to look out for that, men that pretend to adore your child or children as a way of grooming you. He's not a paedophile, the one I married, but I do think he's MK Ultra and dissociative and controlling. And but anyway, my daughter was happy when he and I got married. In fact, that almost tipped me over the edge. Was she said, "Yes, Mummy, let's marry." She wanted him as a daddy as much as I suppose I wanted to get married at 35, having turned down 10 previous or 11 previous proposals. And this is the thing about abuse survivor parents, is that we can be very good parents, but almost always have trust issues and end up with not very healthy relationships to protect our children and model for our children what a healthy relationship is. So the Disney and I married, and 1 year later I had my first son to him. And then something changed. Then my daughter felt that she no longer belonged. She felt, when she saw the absolute devotion the Disney one had for our firstborn son, she realized she felt like she wasn't part of the family. She describes it as feeling that she should go and live in a caravan at the end of the garden, which broke my heart. And then I had another son later. So the Disney one and I married in 93, and in 96 we emigrated back to Ireland. And I had another son in Ireland who's now 24. And when we emigrated back to Ireland, my daughter was 11. Yeah, 96. Yeah, she was coming up 11 anyway. Yeah, she must have been 10. But when she was about 11, she had what was thought to be an asthma attack at the swimming pool at school, on a swimming thing from school. And she got taken to hospital, and they couldn't find any sign of asthma or any reason for her to have had such a bad attack in the swimming pool. And a social worker at Drogheda Hospital asked her, "Is there anything troubling you?" And she then disclosed what her birth father had done to her age 6 or 7. I hadn't heard it. She hadn't disclosed to anybody until then. And she had not remembered what happened at 2.5, certainly not consciously remembered it. And I didn't lie to her about what happened at 2.5, but I just believed the prayer that had been prayed, that all the memory of it would be wiped from her mind. So she disclosed at the hospital to a social worker, and they contacted me, and I was utterly shocked and horrified. And I rang her father in America. I rang my parents, I rang my sisters, including one who was a senior social worker in child protection, the one that they'd been going to stay with on the Isle of Wight until I cancelled that. So I rang my family, I rang the father, and he was so convincing. He said, "You are so focused on your own background, you've projected this onto your daughter. I never touched her, I would never do such a thing. I will fly to Ireland tomorrow and do a lie detector test." And I was still kind of fairly compliant and passive and blind. So then I said, "Let me talk to my family." I talked to my family, including the social worker one. They all agreed with him. "You've made this up. You've made your daughter hypervigilant. She's overheard you talking about child abuse. This never happened. How could you do this to your daughter? Blah, blah, blah." So to my shame, I listened to my family, including the social worker one, and I listened to the father, who had brazenly offered to fly over for a lie detector. I absolutely should have taken him up on that immediately, but I didn't. I was fooled by the offer. He wouldn't offer to do that if it had really happened. So from 11 to 15, for 4 years, myself and my daughter lived in that paradigm of, "Oh dear, I've projected my own fears onto my daughter and this never happened. It's because, it's because she's been molested, she's been raped, orally raped in the past, and it's because so much happened to my sisters and I and my mother in our childhood, well, us girls in our childhood. I'm oversensitive and I've projected a false memory onto my daughter." This is why it's so dangerous to have people denying SRA, denying MK Ultra, denying abuse, these pedo protectors, which inadvertently I was, in my ignorance and in my woundedness. So then when she was 14 or 15, her dad came again on his annual visit, which when I got Gabriella counselling at 11, I said to the social workers, this may not have happened, but just the possibility I will never leave her alone with him again. And if she spends any time with him, I will make sure she's always chaperoned by an adult and they're informed of the allegation and so on. And they were happy with that. He came for a visit and I didn't let her out of my sight. She was 14 or 15 by then. And on his visits, the grooming was still going on. He bought her a pony, he bought her a tack, he'd arrive with hundreds of dollars worth of art supplies. She was into art, and they'd bring her books. He seemed like the perfect father, fooled my entire family, and even the town. You know, he's features in a book produced in the town, and you know, real pillar of the community, dad of the year type. But when he came on the 5th, when she was 14 or 15, and you know, he figured out he wasn't getting loan access to her, and she was probably too old for his tastes by then, but he left behind a backpack, and my daughter found it after he'd gone, and we opened it up, and it had a mini recording dictaphone tape in a cassette, and it had his photo collection from the Burning Man festival, which he was an absolute advocate of and regular attendee. And it had some really creepy, distasteful photographs in it. And something about that, and also the way my daughter related to a new boyfriend that I had, as opposed to the way she related to her dad, it was just stark to me, the difference. It was like she felt completely safe around my new boyfriend, and just able to be a little teenage girl and jump on his lap and laugh, and there was no fear, compared to how she was around her dad. The combination of comparing how she was around Desi and her dad, and then these foul photographs and the mystery dictaphone tape, just the scales came off my eyes, and I realized, oh my God. And I just looked at her and I said, you were telling the truth, weren't you? She just burst into tears and said, why didn't you believe me, Mum? We both cried like babies. And I immediately rang his local cop shop in Manzanito, I think it was called, just outside of Sausalito. I arranged to send the dictaphone cassette to him and the photographs, and told him of the disclosure by my daughter 4 years previously. And he was wonderful. And he listened to the dictaphone, which was my daughter talking, but he just recorded loads of my daughter talking. And he saw the Burning Man photos, which were distasteful to the max. But I'm skipping the bit. Between the age of 11 when she disclosed and 14 or 15 when I believed her, which will go with me to my grave. Between that time, we were in a church, and we'd moved to Dundalk with the church, and we were all in with the church. And I shared with them everything, really. And the pastor's wife made a big deal of saying, you know, it's terrible. I know it's not her fault, but it's terrible what your daughter did to her dad. The poor man, it's the worst thing in the world to be falsely accused of being a child molester, etc., etc. And she said, you really should get your daughter to write him a little card and say sorry. And like a good little Christian, under mind control, backed up by my family and everybody that knew the father, I asked my daughter to do that. And I think she did. She wrote a card and said, sorry, Daddy, for what I said. The grooming was still going on, the confusion, the mind control, you know. So that's what happened. And then when I finally believed her and went into action, because I'd had her a child counsellor from 11 when she disclosed, I had her engaged with a counsellor, but she never discussed anything with him to do with abuse. She just talked about being sad because, you know, mummy and daddy had children from a different marriage and she didn't belong, and she was so angry and mummy wouldn't let her always do what she wanted to do. It was all talked on the surface. She was with that child psychologist from 11 to 19, and he knew. I'd filled him in of what the deep issues were, but he never ever broached it. He said he wasn't allowed to unless she brought up the abuse. He was not allowed to go there. Waste of time. So yes, I didn't force her to write an apology, but I did ask her to, and she did comply. I'll always regret that for the rest of my life. And so when I finally believed her at 15, I begged her forgiveness, including for that. And I got in touch with the police where he lived, and they said yes, they would arrange a criminal standard polygraph test, as they call it, and they were about to enact that, and he was gone out of the country within 3 weeks. He sold everything. He owned apartment buildings in Berkeley. He owned a houseboat. He owned property in Marin. He sold everything and ran away. He had little places he used to like to go to, which all, with hindsight, are renowned for trafficking and child abuse. He went to Cambodia, Fiji, and then ended up in Malaysia, probably Bangkok, Thailand, I don't know, but all places where raping children is endemic. And so there began the healing journey. And to make things worse, around that time, maybe a couple of years later, and I let my daughter rage at me for at least 2 years. I spent probably 10 years trying to compensate, like, just how can I ever make up for not believing my own daughter? But around that time, maybe a couple of years after her disclosure and my attempt to get justice and his fleeing, she found the paperwork from the abuse when she was 2.5, and that almost outraged her more. You know, how could you keep this secret from me? And it also explained a lot of her own internal fears that she hadn't known what explanation there could be for. She was very, she was kind of fearful. She was bullied I moved her from school twice because of bullying. I got her a pony to kind of encourage her to be brave. You know, this is where I can relate to mothers like Sam Baldwin, and even to some extent Ella in the Hampstead case, because some mothers will desperately try and treat the symptoms. So I did notice she was fearful, but only again with hindsight did I realize that the fearfulness was that on a cellular and soul level, she had not forgotten what had happened to her at 2.5, nor was it my right to keep it from her. There should have been a time where I sat her down and said, sweetheart, something terrible happened to you, and I feel partly to blame for leaving you and partly to blame for not seeing Granny Eve with clear sight. But ultimately, you know, I should have, but there never was a right time. And I had had complete faith in the prayer that she would never remember what she didn't remember on a conscious level, but your body and your soul knows what happened to you, even if you're drugged into oblivion or you're prayed into amnesia. You can't just bury that stuff. So she was as angry about that being hidden from her as she was about me not believing her for 4 years. So I did let her be rageful with me for a couple of very intense years, and during that time she got put on Seroxat and nearly killed me. Like lifted up a concrete reinforced bollard from the road and lunged it through my bedroom window, breaking the window. And if I'd have been on my bed, it would have killed me. But I understood. And also the fact she had an adverse reaction to Seroxat. It can make you murderous or suicidal. So it was kind of rocky teenage years, but we got through and we had some good times amongst it. And she turned out good. She wasn't promiscuous. She was very good at school. She went on to university. We had lots of love and laughter, and because I'd left the Disney one years before when they were 3 and 6, I'd left my marriage after a decade. So there were some good and bad times, but the teenage years were tough. I made another mistake. The first boyfriend that she really liked and felt safe around, and which showed up in stark contrast to how she acted around her father, that ended after about 1.5 years. And that was pretty devastating, not just for me, but for my children, especially my daughter had been really fond of him. We'd never lived together. But years later, I got involved with somebody else, again, an alcoholic. You know, until we get healed, we attract the same. He wasn't a paedophile, but he was an alcoholic. Anyway, I'd had him sort of live with us. He'd stayed over probably 3-4 nights a week while my daughter and my 2 sons and I lived here. And there was some of the normal, you're not my father, don't fucking tell me what to do, that kind of stuff going on. And I used to always say to him, I'm sorry she's being rude. She's been through a lot, you know, whatever. And one time, he and I were having an argument in the kitchen. He had a good few pints on him and she intervened. She would have been about 18 or 19. And she called him an alcoholic prick. And he said to her, go to your room. She said, oh, shut your mouth. You're not my effing father, you know. And he said, go to your effing room. Your mother and I love each other. We'll figure this out. And she went upstairs and he followed her up because she was screaming and bashing around. He followed her upstairs and he said something. When she says, you're not my effing father, he said, no, because I'm not an effing pedo or something like that. And a few seconds later, she started screaming hysterically. And I thought it was because he triggered her with such a cruel remark. And she came down and she says, are you going to let him do this to me? And I said, I'm sorry, Gabriella, but she says, you choose, it's him or me. And I said, Gabriella, I would not be being a good mother if I let you dictate who I can have in my life. You can't do that. So she phoned my father to come and get her. Talk about running into the arms of the lion's den. But what I only found out 7 years later was that he had pushed her And she'd not long before, she must have been 18 because she'd been in a car crash. Somebody had crashed into her drunk and she'd really injured her back. And he was a big 6'1" strong guy and she's 5'1". And she'd mouthed off him. She could mouth real gobby, effing and blinding at him and telling him home truths. And he pushed her violently and she hit her back on the shelf that was on the wall, long shelf. And that was what she was saying, are you going to let him do this to me or treat me this way? I didn't know that there'd been any violence. He'd never been violent with me and he'd never been violent with my children, but he was an alcoholic. So she left at 19. And we were kind of estranged for 7 years. She came back for a while. She went and lived with my parents. She'd lived with them for a year before when we were leaving Oldcastle to move to Dundalk. But she would live with them and then she'd say, oh, Mum, I can't stand it. The way they get on at each other, it's just so horrible. Can I come back home? So of course I'd say yes, but it wasn't ideal because if I annoyed her at home, she'd go to them. And if they annoyed her, she'd come. So she kind of had that to play with. But I probably from her age of 15 onwards, I spent trying to compensate for how I'd let her down and what had happened to her twice. It was my worst nightmare. But sadly, the way generational abuse goes on, she then was attracted to abusive men. Horrific. She met the father of my 2 grandchildren. And the first time she brought him home here, she must have been on one of her spells of coming here to live because she was fed up with my parents. He was drunk and he had slapped her around the face because she was chatting animatedly with a gay friend from college. And he'd gotten drunk and got jealous and slapped her around the face. And then, I didn't know this, she told me later, but then I heard him verbally abusing her in bed, calling her the most awful names and just being so abusive. And I jumped out of my bed and I said, get out of my house. How dare you talk to my daughter that way? How dare you? I didn't even know he'd slapped her. But she left with him because I threw him out. She left with him and she stayed in that abusive relationship for 7 years. She rang me. No, she turned up here. I mean, we'd seen each other a bit in the 7 years, but he did everything he could to isolate her from me, from any family or friends of hers. If she wanted to go shopping, he insisted she go with his sisters. If she had a hospital appointment, he insisted she go with his mother. He tried to stop me going to my grandchildren's christenings. He didn't want me at the hospital, and she suffered for days at the hospital. And if I'd have been there, I'd have known straight away. She was traumatized by the male gynecologist who had dealt so inappropriately with her birth that she went into PTSD and she couldn't urinate for days. And she was in agony, and I would have recognized what was going on straight away, but he wouldn't allow me near the hospital. One of my closest suicide attempts was on the day of my grandson's birth, and I only again found out later that she spent 5 days in agony in hospital because of PTSD, because of the way the gynecologist had. I won't go into details, but it was disgusting. So after about 7 years, she where we might see each other just once a year or twice a year, she turned up at 4:30 in the morning with my grandson and 4 months pregnant and said, Mum, it's taken me 2 hours to get here. I was terrified he was going to follow me. You've got to help me, please, please help me get away. And we sat and cried and hugged, and she told me about the violence and the control and the coercion and the isolation and the abuse. And he didn't used to beat her to pulp, but he had her terrified and manipulated, controlled, and and my grandson later told me of the abuse. My grandson was about 2 at the time, and she was 4 months pregnant with their second child when she turned up. And I helped her get away. She got swine flu during her pregnancy. She was hospitalized. I had my grandson. My friend and I went and emptied the house. We helped her find a safe house. She moved far away from him because she said he's covered by the guards. He never gets stopped for no tax, no insurance, no NCT, nothing. I need to get far enough away where it comes into a different jurisdiction. So I helped her find a house and childminder because she had a very good job despite all the control and abuse at home. And we were reconciled. I helped her a lot, and we loved each other. We always love each other, but these things take a toll. And we fell out again just over 2 years ago. And that I can say is probably down to my drinking, because you could, I don't like labels, but I have abused alcohol. Sorry guys, I probably need to wind this up. And oh, it's not 1 o'clock yet. Oh God, it is. I've got a 1 o'clock appointment. I'm gonna have to phone. Let me just message and say this. I'm gonna be late. Right. Where did the time go? Right. I've said this very dispassionately. I haven't cried this time. We've cried rivers over it together. My daughter re-engaged in counselling. She'd stopped at 19, and at 29 she re-engaged and started to do some good work. And she's now 35, and she's a blogger. She's had over 7 million hits on her blog, and she's very successful. Well, that's not always an indicator of being happy. She talks openly about her past and her mental health challenges, and now she's single parenting. Sadly, the cycle continued. She's single parenting my grandchildren, but I hit the bottle big time about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. And she didn't want to deal with that, and I understand that. I'm sober again, but it's hard to trust a parent that has addiction issues. I understand that too. Some people, the wicked people, will twist even this disclosure and use it against me for who knows how long to come. My daughter, although she agreed early on in my online work, I wrote stories about her, and really it was a victory story because she's a beautiful human being and well on the healing journey and very successful. But the curse that continues is not able to sustain a healthy relationship. Just she's single at 35 with 2 young children. She's content, but I know, and she says, and that all she ever wanted was a good marriage and children and a home. And I prayed that for her since she was 18 months old. I used to pray over her every night. Please God, give her a godly husband and a better life than I had. So I didn't mean better by degrees, but that's just the truth about my daughter, my failings with my daughter. And yeah, for the last 2 years, because I went to rehab, quit drinking, and then a few months later started drinking again, she just said, that's it, I'm done. And I also overstepped the mark, you know, did a sort of mum thing about, you know, it was a stupid argument, but I spoke out of turn, which loose lips sink ships, you know. So I do believe we'll reconcile again. I know she loves me, I adore her. And when we're together, people are like, my God, you two are like two halves of a same person. You laugh and you finish each other's sentences and you're so alike and you've got the same sense of humor and blah, 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 blah. But I felt her. And I just would conclude that by saying how I felt her, by being gaslit by my family, gaslit by her father, you know, gaslit by my church, which I left and later exposed. Not just for that, they were complete charlatans. The pastor was having affairs in the church and stealing vast amounts of money. I exposed that, but by the grace of God, my 3 children are pretty wonderful, not addictive, functioning. My 2 younger ones had less trauma and are in healthy relationships and doing well. She's doing great and has mental health issues and periodic estrangements, which sadly now involves the grandchildren too. Her ex co-parents with her, and she seems to have been snake charmed back into a lulled sense of being controlled again without even realizing it. He has the children, my grandchildren, every weekend, half the holidays. And I do think he has a huge part in trying to separate his children from my orbit. And I'll end with a final bit of truth, which is, I believe that's because he made a pass at me in the past, and I told my daughter. And I think ever since then, he's been determined to discredit me. So, hope you enjoyed that, Shelley May O'Brien. And I pray for my children that they'll do better than I did, and their children will do better than they did, and the cycle will be broken. Yeah, the final thing I wanted to say was social workers should not use this. I'm horrified to find that social workers they'll steal babies from mothers on the absolute grounds of, you were abused in childhood, you grew up in care, we need to take your baby for fear of future emotional harm. And listening to my story, you might think that, oh yeah, that's valid. But look at the statistics of what happens to children in care or trafficked into adoption. And make your own mind up. But it is a myth that most abused people go on to abuse. Very few do. And most abuse survivors that become parents want more than anything to protect their children from what happened to them. I'm late for my next appointment. God bless.